Some time ago I asked people what kind of authentication setup they would like to see with ASP.NET Core, and people said Angular with cookie authentication and using identity framework with entity framework. So that is what we're going to be covering today. I'm going to expect you know at least some ASP.NET Core, watch some of my previous videos, and you know Angular, hopefully more than me because I don't do Angular. Without wasting too much time, let's go ahead and get started. The setup is pretty minimal. Program CS is pretty much empty, where I just have an extensions method on the web application builder that is setting up a proxy to my SPA application. If you don't know how to do this, go ahead and watch my videos about ASP.NET Core and SPA setup. The link is going to be in the description. Nevertheless, I'm creating an API group, and all of the endpoints that I'm going to be putting here are not on the app, but rather on the /API endpoint. That's because all of the other routes are going to be within this client library, which is a Angular SPA application. I have the both applications running in terminal. This is a clean .NET Core application, and this is an Angular application. This is what it currently looks like. We got a couple of links here, although no routing has been set up. So the application is pretty minimal. All I've done is cleared out the template and I've added a couple of routes. In my app modules, I have also set up the HTTP client because we're gonna be sending credentials back and forth. We're gonna need to log in essentially. And then for my app routing, nothing is set up over here. First of all, we're going to set up three main components of authentication. That is registration, logout, and then signing in. What I'm gonna do on the client is I'm gonna open up a new terminal and I'm gonna use ng generate command. So if you don't know what ng is, perhaps this video is not for you. I'm going to generate a component, and this component is going to be login. I'm also going to generate one for register, and then I'm going to generate a service, and this is going to be my authentication service. So I'm just going to call it auth. Now I'm going to collapse the terminal, and I have my login page, I have my register page, and I have my auth service, which is marked provided in root, which should make it global. The authentication service is going to be core to what we're trying to do, so I'm going to inject a private HTTP client into here, and we're going to have three functions: load user, login, and register. These are the things that we want to perform, and if we actually want the functionality for this, we should implement the endpoints on the backend. So let's go ahead and add the following three endpoints: user, login, and register. For the user endpoint, we're going to convert the current user and his claims to a dictionary, and we will return this. For the login endpoint, we're submitting a login form with user name and password. We're not consuming the password just yet. We're starting off simple. We just want to create a cookie, and we're signing in with the cookie authentication schema. In order to be able to actually sign in with this, at the top for the services, we will need to add our authentication. This is going to be the default cookie authentication, and it's going to point to the services that are registered by the add cookie method. And this is going to say cookie as well. So we identify the functions with the cookie authentication schema. We're saying that it's the default authentication schema. And then here we're signing in with this authentication schema. For the registration, we're going to leave this as to do, and then we will duplicate this, create a logout endpoint. On here, the results we will call sign out. And for the authentication schemas, let's provide a list of strings where we're just going to say that we want to sign out of the only authentication schema that we have, which is going to be cookie. I like to keep my endpoints clean, so I'm going to take out the functions into their own files. So inside my solution, I'm going to create a directory for endpoints. Inside endpoints, I'm going to add a couple of classes, like the user, endpoint. I'll move the handler to here, and on the other side, all I have to do is specify that for this endpoint, I am using the user endpoint handler. Now I'm going to do the same for the other endpoints. Here's my login endpoint. I'll leave register alone for now. And here's my logout endpoint. So our program CS ends up looking quite neat. The last thing that we need to do is go into this build with SPA extension that we have set up over here and attach the use authentication middleware. Even though we're using .NET 7, we have to attach it manually because we ended up overriding the whole middleware. Come back to the auth service, close everything else, and I accidentally closed the auth service. And now we want to start implementing these methods as well as the logout. First of all, we'll load the user from the user endpoint, quite simple. Here's the final login endpoint. It looks quite simple as well. One thing that we need to not forget is to specify the options and say with credentials set to true. This is going to make sure that the cookie that is going to be returned is going to be automatically stored in the browser. One thing to note, I've set this up as post, and I think in program CS over here, I set login to be get. So let's change this to map post. For register, it's going to be the same, and then logout, we will leave it alone, but we want to make sure that only authenticated users are going to be hitting the logout endpoint. So we add require authorization. In order to be able to use this, we need to register authorization, semicolon on the end, and then inside build with spa, we got to make sure that we're using authorization. So use authorization middleware in order for the services that have been registered over here to get triggered. If we don't specify a policy, this is just going to make sure that the user is actually signed in before trying to reach logout. Coming back to the auth service, for the logout, we just want to hit a get endpoint. And I think that's it for now with the auth service. We'll leave register alone. We'll take the auth service and we're going to take it to our login page. So login component, we will specify providers, auth service in here. Let's get a constructor going, private auth service. And then of course a proxy function where you would have some of your validation living, etc. And a neat little form. I'm using fields for each individual thing. You want to bring in a type, use TypeScript. I'm more of a JavaScript person myself. Let's get a login form going. There we go, a humble login form. I'm now gonna go into the main component in the HTML over here, and I'm just gonna add a button for logging out. And there's the logout button. Let's see how good the ID is. So the logout, I wanted a function, but that's not quite it, so it can't figure that part out, but let's create a logout function. We will need the auth service for this. Again, proxying the function call and making sure that we specify the provider. Not sure what this squiggly is, but I'm pretty sure it's all right. So inside app component, let's just make sure we got the parentheses over here. We're gonna come back here, refresh, and we got the page. So as always, open up the developer tools, the network tab. Let's go to the login page. I haven't set up the routing, so let's go ahead and do that. Inside app routing module, let's go ahead and slap on a path. Login with component. Login component. Let's do the same for register. There we go. Let's give this a refresh, go to login. Let me double check that I don't have any cookies stored just yet. So I'm going to clear everything out. Back to the network tab. We'll have Anton, password 1. I'll submit the form. When I click, nothing is happening, even if I have the all selected over here. No errors in the console, so I must have messed something up. Let's go to the login component. Okay, so submit, let's instead use click, and that wasn't what I wanted. There we go. Before I log in, I'm gonna clear everything. Let's log in, there we go. So in login, I have the set cookie, so cookie should be set in my browser. I'm gonna go to application, I'm gonna see the cookie. Perfect. If I log out, the cookie is being deleted, and that is because if I go to the network tab, I'm gonna see the logout call, and in the response header, I can see that it is asking me to remove my cookie. Cool. So let's log back in. I should have the cookie. Now let's implement the user fetching. So when your application is going to load, it should fetch the user. And during the construction of the auth service, I don't know how terrible this is going to be. So let's actually just clean this up a little bit. We're going to return this from here. And we will just call this load user from the beginning. Before we assign the user, let's also console log it. So console log user and then assign this user. We're going to come back. So we're loading the user and the username is empty. So first of all, we're loading the user twice. And second of all, the model binding has perhaps failed us. So let's double check what is happening. If we come back to the network tab, the history is saved. If we go into login and we take a look at the payload, this is just my inability to Angular, and I've not actually submitted any information when I was logging in. Not on the first time, not on the second time. So C# is still working. Let's figure out what is happening with Angular. So we took the auth service, we have registered inside app modules, or no, we didn't. So anyway, I think register the auth service over here so it's globally available, and then we don't attach it in the providers anywhere else. So we're gonna go into the login form over here and remove the auth service from here. We will come back. And now if we take a look in the console, we are loading it only a single time. Let's fix the login form after looking this up. I have gone ahead and seen ng model. Looks like I will need to import ng forms module, and writer is carrying me, so I'm happy with that. Let's come back. I'm going to re-sign in as Anton, clear everything, log in, and now we're submitting information. If I look over here and I refresh, Anton is now part of my user information. So the user is loaded on startup. The user can be loaded after we log in. I don't know the idiomatic way to do this, but if I go into authservice.ts, let's say I'm logging in over here and this has happened. I want to go ahead and call this load user, and this should work just fine. If I come back over here, let's go ahead and clear or even log out. So if I refresh, I should get something that looks like empty. I can check for presence of a user ID, but let's say Anton, password, log in, and the user will automatically be injected. I can then redirect, so on and so forth. Let's implement the user ID check. So I'll have something like this. You can put additional functions that are going to represent if the user is signed in or not. I will go into the main page and I'm just going to output the user from here. So I will need to proxy this from the auth service, I assume. We're going to be looking at something like this, and I'm expecting this to crash, and it does. So what you really want to be doing is in your app.component, this is going to be your centralized first initialization stage. You want to place something like ng init or whatever it's called. So this ng on init, let's go ahead, put it over here, refer to auth and initiate the login right over here. So this auth load user, we're going to do it right here. And we're going to remove the load from this constructor, which wasn't very good anyway. So let's refresh. We're still going to get an error because the subscription hook is asynchronous. After looking this up, looks like they want me to rely on the first value from the RxJS library. So this function right over here. I gotta grab this call and put it over here. This now becomes an awaitable promise. So const user, and then take this if statement logic over here, place it over here, and perhaps return the user. I think I'm okay to leave this promise over here dangling. If somebody knows how to use the HTTP client better, please make sure that you suggest it to other people in the comments. Now back to the app component.ts. When I load the user, let's make the function asynchronous. Await, and I'm gonna get the user on the back of this, but I'm gonna ensure that when this component loads, all the other components are going to have the user. So I'll assign the username by doing something like this, maybe shift the username over here, format everything, and then display the username besides the login button or the logout button. So a good looking username, and now let's take a look at this, and there we have it. So refreshing, basically the user gets loaded right at the beginning. Now will be a good time to transition from our mock authentication to real authentication with identity and entity framework core. For this, we're going to go into program CS, and actually I'm going to take this login form and move it to the login endpoint over here. Close this off, bring out my NuGet package manager and bring in entity framework core. I'm going to add this to Angular. I'm going to also add Postgres, so entity framework core PostgreSQL. Add this over here as well. And then the design as well, because I'm going to be needing to add migrations. I'll collapse the NuGet package manager. Let's quickly take a look at the CS proj. I'm going to have the following packages as part of entity framework core. I'll close this down. We will go and sit somewhere above authentication, where we will say builder services and add identity. In here, we will have to specify identity user with identity role, I believe. And then we will need to link this up with entity framework. So let's add entity framework or something like store or DB context. I believe I'm missing a package. So entity and identity. I'm going to search for entity framework and scroll down a little bit, and I'll find Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity Entity Framework core package. I'm going to add this to my project. Let's collapse this down, and now I should have the extension to set this on a DB context or entity framework stores. And for this, I will actually need a database. So let's go ahead and add a directory called data. In here, I'm going to add my database. With the database class, I'm going to make it extend from DB context, or better yet, identity DB context, where it's going to be storing identity users. If you're not familiar with identity framework, the identity DB context will come with a bunch of things So it will inherit from a class, which inherits from a class, which inherits from 10 other things, but ultimately this is going to contain the DB sets for storing things like roles, claims, users, etc. So with this database, if we just quickly test this out, we don't need to pull this anywhere. We'll just take this to program CS. If we have this database over here and we do .NET, we can access users, user claims. We can do all of this interaction ourselves. However, when we're registering add identity, and if we follow down the chain of these methods and look further down, we're gonna see services like user manager, sign-in manager, role manager, a bunch of these services. All they're doing is they already have pre-built functionality to interact with an identity DB context. And because your database inherits from it, it is an identity DB context. So all you have to do now is link identity to this database, register this database as a DB context with the services. So add DB context database. We'll also need to add a default token provider. So our identity framework is linked with the database and the database is now registered. We now need a connection string. So I'm going to go into app settings. I'll create a connection string section. Here I will specify my default connection string, then coming back to program CS. For the configuration over here, I will say I want to use npg SQL. Inside I will have to supply a connection string, which will come from builder, configuration, and get connection string, and we're getting the default connection string. And now all is left to do is to run the migrations. So let's open this up. We're going to use .NET EF migrations add identity. Looks like I'm not referencing this package, so let's listen to entity framework and get the correct package. And not the relational one, just the design one. So let's get that in. I have a feeling I have brought that in as part of the PostgreSQL design, so let's actually get rid of it. I'm going to remove that from the CS project, come back to program CS and make sure that this is installed. It should be. Bring back the terminal and rerun the command. And I get a pretty ugly error. No database provider has been configured for this database context, and that is just because I haven't actually generated a constructor. So let's generate some code. We're going to get the constructor with the DB context options. This can be a generic type, and we're going to specify the database here. Let's rerun the command. Now update the database. And looks good to me. Let's just restart our application. And looks like everything is still working. Now, with Identity Framework, it is important to realize that if we open up Add Identity, and again we go down the chain, it is adding Add Authentication on our behalf. So we don't actually have to call this function anymore, and it also adds a bunch of cookie authentication schemas, which we really don't care about. It is going to be this cookie authentication schema that is going to take care of most of the stuff. So let's come back into Program CS, and we're going to remove the authentication that we're adding over here. The user endpoint can remain as it is. However, the login endpoint, if we go into the handler over here, in addition to the login form, we want to supply a sign-in manager for the type of identity users. So this is just going to be a sign-in manager. Let's also give this function a body. Whatever we've been doing over here is now implemented under the hood in the sign-in manager. Using the sign-in manager, sign-in password async. So from the form, we're going to grab the username and we're going to grab password. And then you can see this is persistence flag. This is the same as having this persistence flag over here, although now it's going to be supplied as a parameter in this function. We can say we want it as true, and all that this is persistence flag is going to do is it will make sure that the cookie stays in the browser after you close it. The last flag, we will supply it as false. If we hover over it, we will see that it's lockout on failure. If you need that as true, configure it as true. Let's go ahead and put a wait over here, and there is going to be a result. If the result is successful, return OK. If the result is not successful, let's return a bad request. We will clean up the imports, we will copy the whole class, and we're going to create a register endpoint now. So register endpoint, paste everything in here, clean up the file a little bit, change the form. So we got password and confirm password. You can implement whatever validation you like here, fluent attribute. I'm gonna roll my own if statement next level 3000 validation extraordinaire. You know what I'm talking about here. In addition to the sign-in manager, we want to bring in a user manager. A user manager is another type that is provided to you that is specifically managing the entities in the database. A sign-in manager is integrating with all the authentication handlers with regards to dealing out the cookies and all of that. The sign-in manager internally is actually going to use the user manager. So let's go ahead and specify the user manager over here. Well, we'll use the user manager to create a sync, and we have to supply a user over here. So var user equals new identity user, and we can give this user a username from the form. Let's create the user, and the second parameter can be password. Await on this. This is going to have a result, and let me scroll down. If we fail to create a user, let's short circuit. If we've managed to do it successfully, let's sign the user in. We don't need to reuse the password. We can just take the user that we have just created and supply that instead of the username and password. We can also just say that sign this user in. And the function signature looks different, so let's open it up. We will see that we supply a user, persistence, and authentication method. For some reason, they decided to stop going with authentication schemas, and they're saying authentication method. Let's remove this. We don't need this. There is going to be no result over here, and we are going to return OK. Other things that you can do here is, if you have email confirmation, send an email and then wait for the user to redirect to your application to confirm their email, so on and so forth, and only sign the user in at the login endpoint rather than at the registration endpoint. That is something that you can do. I'm not going to be doing it here. Let's go to the top here. We'll take the register endpoint to program, and we're going to specify the handler over here. Going down into the logout endpoint, we can keep the function pretty minimalistic as we currently have it, although we will need to specify the sign-in schema, which is pretty much buried somewhere here in that identity. So if you never open it up, you're not gonna know to put in the specific string, which is going to be looking something like this. So cookie prefix identity.application, you're not gonna know to use this, right, if you don't open this up. So the way that you sign out is you have to bring in the sign-in manager. And if we actually take a look at the sign-in manager over here, right, you have sign out async, which is what you want to do. Let's go to the logout endpoint. Let's bring in the sign-in manager. We're gonna take sign-in manager. Let's just call sign out async over here. We're gonna transform this into a proper function. We'll await on it, and we're going to return a result OK. And there we go. Isn't that pretty? With this setup pretty much done, let's see if the application restarts. Looks like we got a couple of warnings, but you know, it works. So let's take a look. In the application cookies, let's clear the cookie. We're going to refresh and we don't have the user. I don't think I have a registration screen, so let's quickly make that. I'm gonna go down to client, src. I'm going to close all of the windows, not to confuse myself. I'm gonna go into login, copy the form, going into register, HTML, paste the form over here. I'm gonna bring in confirm password and confirm password over here. I'm gonna go into login component TS. I'm gonna copy everything and up to constructor over here. Go to register component TS, paste everything in. Make sure I bring in my confirm password. So confirm password over here. Duplicate this line of code, right? Just copy pasta everything. Instead of login, I want to call register. And if I go down to the register function, I'm gonna copy login form. Put it over here. This is now going to be register form. I'm going to do the same post. Instead, I'm submitting register form, and I'm also going to be calling to the register endpoint. In the end, this is also going to load a user. You can return the user from these endpoints that you're signing up and logging in at. So instead of just returning OK, return the user, and then you don't need to make the additional call. You can do that as well. Completely legal. Let's come back to the application. We'll go to the register page. There we go. So let's say Anton. Let's do one like this. I don't know if I'm hitting validation or not. So what are these? These are bad requests. So I think I'm hitting validation. Let's put this here. And we're still failing. So this could be for many reasons. Partly, this could be due to identity framework configuration. We're going to go over here and we're going to have some options. And what you want to do is you want to specify some sensible development options. In your builder, so if builder, you're going to find the environment and you can say if the environment is development, Let's say that on the options, user require unique email, false, and then on options password, you want to disable all of this crap. So require digit. So you do something like this just to make your life a little bit easier. Let's come back over here and let me copy password 1 and everything deleted. Thank God I have managed to copy it. So let's log in. And there we go. The registration has been successful. However, the user next to the logout button has not been updated. I'm pretty sure if I refresh, we still don't see the user. If we take a look, we got the payload. So the schema, basically the claims, Microsoft claims they look different. So if you actually want the username, you will need to map it to something sensible. But let's say, yeah, we'll take this. We want the name. So when I open up the application and on init, I want to grab this user claim and assign it here. Again, take your user, map it to whatever data structure you want. Currently, if I want my data being displayed really pretty, that is what I have to bring in. Also, I don't know how exactly what I'm doing over here, how reactive this is. If it is, then, well, no problem. Also, just for pedantic reasons, let's go into the register page. So register component HTML. Let's make sure we call this register form. While we're signed in here, let's log out. So we cleared, and yeah, this is not reactive. So if I refresh, this should be gone. If we go into login, and just quickly on the reactivity thing, if you're Angular master, you're gonna have no problem setting up this reactivity. In Vue, we have Vuex, whatever reactive global state you need to set up for your services, please do it. If you have some library for centralized global storage, I would highly recommend you store your user information in that. In here, let's go ahead and try to sign up. That is copied code. So hopefully I remember my password. Log in, and I do not. Was it 1? Enter doesn't work, and it was 1. So let me copy it over. There is the cookie, and again, if I refresh, I should have the user. The last order of business will be to actually bring in some data and store it in the database. So let's go to the database. We will create some models. We have a project, and then the project may contain some work tasks. The point here is to see how can we authorize access to a project using ASP.NET Core. So let's register these entities with the database. And now we want a user table. So public class project user. You can also call this project access. So what kind of access does a user have to a project? This is going to look something like this. And there we have it. So hopefully Entity Framework can support this. We'll say project users. We'll go down to program CS. We'll grab the API endpoints variable, create some space, and start putting the endpoints over here. So we can list projects, we can try to go to a specific project, we can try to add users to a project. So just because a user can look at a project doesn't mean the user can add other users to a project. And finally, what I would like to see is promoting a user to somebody who can now start adding users to a project. We will add a promote endpoint, which is going to allow us to promote a user. And also, I forgot the user ID on here. I'm gonna make sure that this is a map post as well as the promotion call. I'm going to do the same thing with these endpoints as I've done over here and create these endpoints in this endpoint folder over here. I'm sure my face is hiding it, but rest assured I will create these classes over here. Here are my project endpoints, specifically the list endpoint. I'm injecting the user, the database, getting a user ID based on the name identifier claim types, and then I have a mismatch between the user ID that I get over here, which is going to be a string, and then a GUID that I'm storing in the database. So let's just store a string in the database, come back to the project endpoints, grab project endpoints class, come back to program CS, and place list right over here. We're now going to attach some additional endpoints. For the get endpoint, we're attaching an ID, and then we're also filtering based on this ID. Let's take it to program CS, attach the get function. Let's create the add user endpoint. Here is our add user to project function. It takes a project, adds a user, saves the changes, returns OK. Let's take this function, program CS, same spiel, assign it to this endpoint. And before we talk about promoting the users, we need to understand what kind of permissions are going to lie here. If you're trying to list the projects, you're going to require authorization. If you're trying to get a project, you're going to require authorization. Now, the important thing here is on the get endpoint, our authorization rule is this where statement right over here. Specifically, it's here on the list endpoint as well. What we can actually do is take this where remove it from here and shift this logic to an individual authorization handler and an individual requirement. I would highly recommend that you do not do this. Do not force your business rules into the ASP.NET Core framework. Only use the framework for specifying policies, like for example, you're trying to upgrade the user, and this is going to be a manager policy. So let me hide the solution view over here. So when we're going to promote a user, what we're really doing is we're enabling that user to now add users to a project. And the only reason that you would do something like this, where you are actually relying on the authorization with the ASP.NET Core framework, is because this is very easy. However, this is still stored in the database. You can still do this validation on your endpoints. You don't need to cram this logic into requirements, into authorization handlers, etc. Remember that your database is an identity DB context. When you're going to be elevating privileges, you're going to be adding stuff to the roles tables, to the role claims tables, etc. Let's come back to Program CS and let's create our promote endpoint. I'm going to bring in the Solution Explorer. I'm going to create a promote endpoint. Here's the promote endpoint where we promote the user. Just submit the user ID and then we find the user and give him a level claim where the value of the level claim is manager. So now based on this, we need to create our authorization policy. We'll take the class and make sure we attach the endpoint. So right over here, promote endpoint, promote user. Let's drop down the solution and require authorization. Only an admin may promote managers. Okay. Now in add authorization, here we're going to have options, and on the options, we are capable of specifying policies. So add policy. First, let's specify the manager policy. We're going to have a policy builder. And the policy is only going to have a single requirement, that you have a level claim with the value of manager. If we copy this and create an equivalent admin policy, well, we'll notice that if our admin has an admin claim, we will not be able to reach manager because the level claim is going to have admin. It's not going to have manager. So what we can do is we can say that the level claim can either be manager or it can be admin. If we hover over here, we can see allowed values, where we must match one of these. Now from the beginning, we're not going to have a user that is going to be an admin, so we will need to pre-seed it, and I haven't added any of the logic for creating the project, etc. We will need to seed that logic as well. There are a couple of places where you can do the seeding logic, either in the build with SPA, which is going to be a good place. So in here, we will have the app after we have built it. So here we can grab app services. This is going to be a service provider. We can get required service like user manager for identity user, and let me make sure I scroll down so we have some space. This is going to be user manager. If there is no admin in the database, we want to create the user and also give him a claim. Then we want to do the same with the database. So let's grab our database. If there aren't any projects, we will add a couple of projects and save the changes. We will now grab the user, place the user right over here, make sure that we create them. And then when we're adding these users, the admin is going to be there by default. Now we have added a bunch of tables and stuff like that, so we will need to run migrations. Let's come back to this tab over here. I will bring up the previous migrations for projects. We'll update the database. I'll start up the application again. Looks like I get an error that I cannot resolve a scoped service. Let's create a scope. After creating a scope, we want to be resolving these services from the scope. So service provider, and we'll do the same for the database. Let's restart the application. Looks like everything has launched successfully. Again, let's come back to the application, clear everything, drop down the terminal and navigate to the app. I'll add a page for projects. So ng generate component projects. Drop this down. Projects is right over here. I think I named it something else as well. This is just going to be on the home route. So coming back to the routing module, create a path that is empty. And this is going to be a projects component. Closing down app routing. We'll rename this to projects. We'll open project components.ts and HTML and start working with this. So first of all, let's add a constructor, our HTTP client. And there we have it. When we load this page, we try to load all of the projects. If we come back and we actually try to do it, so projects, we see that projects work. And projects indeed was successful. And that is because we are authenticated. But first of all, let's actually clear this. Let's log out, and we have actually logged out. Let's log in as the admin. Looks like that has been successful, cool. And we're on projects. Let's render them in a nice looking list. Here's the HTML for listing projects. If we take a look at the HTML, we have it. Now I'm gonna spawn another window where I'm also going to sign in, although as a different user. I'll give this a quick registration and I'm gonna go into project. So over here, I'm not gonna see anything. If I go to the network tab and I get the user ID that I wanna add, so let me just copy this. If I try to get the individual project, it's not going to work for me. As I said before, you don't want to move that logic for getting individual resources into authorization handlers. I think that is not going to be very nice. We're going to add an input form for adding a user to a project and also promoting. So there is the amendment, the input form for the user. We're going to promote him. I'll just add a click event over here. Promote, don't need a parameter. On the other side, let me put this on here actually. I'll hide the solution view and make sure that I add a user. From the beginning, it's going to be an empty string. And then the promote and add user functions. So on the promote, let's take about yay much. Let me remind what kind of endpoint we have. So this is a post and the add user is a post as well. We post and we're promoting this user ID instead of await. I'll place a return here and we do the same for the project. So /projects. First of all, we supply the project ID and then we add this specific user. Let's come back to the browser and actually looks like I have a bunch of errors. I'm guessing it's because we are not submitting a body. Let's close the HTML and submit null over here as well. Come back to the browser. I will have to specify that project ID is any type. Goddamn TypeScript. And that looks good. So on the user, let's again grab the GUID. I'll take about yay much. Let's see what happens if I try to promote myself. I'm gonna get an redirect to access denied, which is okay. If I try to promote the user in the network tab, the promotion should have succeeded. I didn't get any response, but that is pretty much what you get. So if we refresh the projects, nothing is going to happen because we haven't received the claims. Now you can use an iClaims transformer to keep loading the claims, or if you don't want to rely on the claims in the cookie or use the claims transformer, you can always query the database. That is where the claims are. However, I'm gonna log out. I'm gonna log back in with test password, log in, go back to projects, and navigating to projects, we don't see them because I've promoted myself. And let's make sure we understand that. Promotion, okay, admin promotes, manager can add. So now I can actually add to projects, but I'm not part of any projects that I can add to. So for the user that we have specified over here, let's add him to project 1. Looks like I have an exception of GUID user ID was not provided from the query string. Let's come back over here to the add user to project and the endpoint over here, user ID to add. This is just going to be user ID. Okay, so there's a name mismatch. Let's go to add to user ID project. Let's put him over here and probably could have this as string. No need to convert to string from GUID. Come back to program CS, remove the typo annotation. Let's come back to the front end, not this one over here. Obviously, I will need the user ID again. So let's go over here, grab the user ID. Oh, yay much. Come back over here, supply the user ID, add user to the project. So another cool little error, a null reference exception on line 41. So let's double check what that is. Add user to project, line 41. Users is probably null. I'm gonna assume that project has actually retrieved something. So on users over here, let's just say that this is going to be a new list, that the task is going to be a new list. You know, we don't want any surprises. Let's come back over here and, well, speaking of no surprises, we already had a couple of surprises. So anyway, let's supply the user ID, clear, add, and now the addition is successful. If we refresh now, we have access, and this user, since he has been elevated to manager, I'm not going to show it, but will be able to add other users because Through the admin, we already know that that logic is working. And this will be it for this video. Angular authentication with Identity Framework with Entity Framework Core. Identity Framework services under the hood, like the user manager, the sign-in manager, they're all going to be using the DB context under the hood, and all the other functionality of results.signin or HTTP context.signin to produce a cookie or kick off the authentication handler under the hood. So if you've watched all my other videos, you're going to understand how to set this stuff up. So that's mainly on the identity management side and on the authentication. Particularly on the authentication, let's quickly mention the login screen. Generally with Razor pages, you're going to see a form with CSRF tokens being posted, etc. I would say you don't need to worry about the CSRF token, and you just submit your credentials using JavaScript. So if you ever wanted a JavaScript frontend for your authentication component, now you can have it. I'm telling you, there is no problems with it. Finally, once you're signed in, we're coming around to authorization, which can be a little bit more complicated. And it can be complicated only if you make it. We've seen how we can protect endpoints based on claims, and that is very easy. If we would have taken that resource access, that access to a task, and started jamming the rules for whether a user should be able to access that task or not into some authorization handler, creating requirements for it, etc., things would start to get very messy. So when you're doing authorization, apply it to a group of endpoints rather than the individual resources or individual data access behind those endpoints. Don't force that part into ASP.NET Core. Otherwise, this will be it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments section. If you enjoy my work and would like access to the source code, please come support me on my Patreon. Very, very big thank you to all of my patrons that are currently choosing to support me. Your help is greatly appreciated. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.